Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah alayhi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So today we're going to talk about guidance and whether or not the madhabs are necessary in order for us to have guidance. So, of course, the first questions that pop up are about madhabs in general, the different schools of fiqh, but we won't start there, just simply because in order to understand the conversation about whether or not following a specific school of legal thought is necessary, we first have to understand exactly what the levels of knowledge are that each person could possibly have. So we all know that there's two kinds of knowledge. You have what is fard and what is not fard, right? So your basic things that you do in life, like your job, that is not necessarily fard knowledge because you're not religiously required to know medicine or to know law or to know how to drive a car, for instance. You are required to know certain things within the religion. Obviously, we're going to go over this very briefly. We all have to know how to pray. Every sane adult Muslim has to know how to pray. We have to know how to fast. We have to know how to do things that we personally do that are religiously obligatory on us. So, for instance, knowing what to believe. Now, the next thing we have, and those are individually obligatory on us, fard. Now, the next one is the communal obligations, right? Not every Muslim needs to know how to wash a body, right? When someone dies, not everyone needs to know how to do that. But there has to be at least someone in the community that washes people when they die. Now, the knowledge of how to do that is not obligatory on everyone, right? So if you're not one of the people who does this, you don't have to know how to do it. That's not required of you. However, if you are one of the people who has decided that you will engage in this activity and fulfill the communal obligation, now this knowledge is personally obligatory on you. So as you can see, this knowledge is generally a communal obligation, but the person who undertakes it, now it is a personal obligation on them. It's no longer communal. This also goes with things like, for instance, if we're talking about commercial transactions, if you do not engage in commercial transactions, you wouldn't need to know how to do them. However, if you do engage in these transactions, it would be mandatory for you to know how to do them. And then we get into more theoretical things. So if you open books of fiqh, you'll oftentimes find, Islamic criminal law. So for instance, when do we apply the had punishment? When are ways we wouldn't? So if someone stole something, do they have their hand removed or do they not have their hand removed? What is their punishment? How does that process work? Well, if you don't live in a Muslim majority country, you live somewhere like here in the United States, that knowledge is theoretical because it doesn't matter if someone steals from you, no one's cutting their hand off, right? Much in the same way that, and if you did live in a country like that, then a person who's acting as a judge or a person who's acting within the legal system would be required to know this information to make the appropriate judgment. In the same way, for the most part, Islamic international relations is also theoretical for most of us. How should the Islamic State act in declaring any kind of conflict with another country? Well, that doesn't apply to anyone in the US, so it's not obligatory for us to know this. If you lived in, say, Saudi Arabia, and they have an Islamic government and they're going to follow those rules as they should, being a majority Muslim country, not every Muslim would need to know how to do that, right? Only Muslims who work within the military apparatus of the country or the diplomatic apparatus of the country would need to know those rules. So for us in the US, those rules, since they're more theoretical for us, somebody still has to know them, right? That's a communal obligation that everything is known by someone. So that if there were a situation one day where a president and Congress got together and changed the Constitution in the very unlikely event that they would, and they decided we're going to start practicing the way that Islamic law is supposed to work, someone has to be able to teach them, right? So scholars generally take on that knowledge, and it becomes obligatory for them to have knowledge of their field, whether it's fiqh, it's tafsir, it's Quran, it's whatever their field is. They should have mastered the field sufficiently enough that they'll be able to teach people how to do these things in case that need arises. So, for instance, that's why there are scholars in the community fulfilling needs for a lot of this knowledge for us, and they have it. Right now, if you engage in commercial transactions, again, you need to know the fiqh of commercial transactions. You know, Umar, the Sahaba Umar, radiallahu anh, he wouldn't allow people to transact in the marketplace until he was satisfied that they understood the fiqh of transactions. Because if you don't understand it, you could obviously fall into trouble. So now that we have that, the next question that usually pops up is, well, okay, I'll go learn how to figure that out, right? And in order to do that, we have to start with the different levels of how people know things, right? So the top level, the highest level that almost no one is at in this time, in the era that we live in, is what's known as independent ijtihad, right? They do not follow a single madhab, they don't follow a single school of Islamic reasoning or thought. They actually look at the Quran and the Sunnah and different things the Sahaba have said and different factors, and they come up with rulings of their own. Now, there are very few people who are at that level. Of course, we know people like Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Shafi, Abu Hanifa, Malik. They all were at that level. In fact, some of their students were too, like Abu Yusuf and Muhammad and the companion of Abu Hanifa, Muhammad. They all were at that level as well, even though they didn't necessarily act on it. Now, to get to that level, you'd have to master all of the Islamic sciences for the most part and have a mastery of the Arabic language. Unfortunately, most people who speak Arabic would say, well, I've mastered the Arabic language, and they would be wrong. Just as many people who speak English natively say, I've mastered English. And then you look at what they say and what they write, and you're like, no, you have not mastered this language. What we talk about mastery is when you come upon something, like for instance, if you open a book of hadith and you see a word you're not familiar with, even people who speak English have to look in a dictionary every once in a while, right? But you're looking in it and you see this word that's unfamiliar. Of course, everyone's first reaction is, I'll pull out my Arabic dictionary or go to Google Translate. Well, if you did that, you might come up with the wrong answer because the correct way to do this would be to open a lexicon. And a lexicon, of course, is sort of like a dictionary, but it tells you the usage of the word at the time and place and in the situation. So you'll find, Quran lexicons, hadith lexicons, fiqh lexicons of different eras, so you can determine what they really meant by a word. Now, without getting too much into that linguistic aspect of it, there's other things you'd have to master too. You'd have to have a mastery of fiqh, which means you would have had to have followed a school of fiqh at some point to do that. And the next level down we have is those who they don't claim to practice independent ijtihad. What they do is something known as comparative fiqh, right? And what these people are doing is they're essentially saying, I have rulings from various scholars throughout time, and I know enough about the legal methodologies those scholars used, the madhabs they followed, whether it was a Hanafi opinion or a Maliki opinion, Shafi or Hanbali, or from one of the schools that are not present anymore in this time. And I'm going to go ahead and see, based on their methodologies, based on the ruling, and based on the evidences that they're all using, and other evidence I may find, which ruling is the right ruling. And you'll see this a lot in books. There are certain books of fiqh, including a translation of Amdat al-Fiqh, which is a Hanafi book, Hanbali book of fiqh, right? So this one Hanbali book, it was translated, and the translator actually went and listed out the opinions, the majority and minority opinions of every single school of fiqh, and then gave their opinion as to which one would be the right opinion, right? So, of course, there's issues with that. If you're not trained in this methodology, which most people are not, of course, you might end up, for instance, wuzu, right? We know that certain madhabs say one thing breaks it, others say, no, 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 that does not break it. For instance, eating camel meat breaks your wuzu in the Hanbali madhab. It doesn't break it in the other three, right? Now, if you look at some madhabs, they would say that if you know, had pus coming out of your skin or blood that would break, or blood came out of you, that would break your wudu. Well, the Hanbali madhab might say, no, it doesn't. So if you were to start saying, well, I think the Hanbalis are wrong about camel meat, I think the Hanafis might be wrong about bleeding or pus, and you were to take both of those away, you might end up with wudu that is valid according to no school, right? So a completely invalid act now. You might pray in a way that no one would consider valid because you've just picked things apart. And you always have to make sure that if you're going to take another opinion from a different school, you're keeping your actions valid. Now we come down one more level. And this is where, if you are in the St. Louis area, you'll see it, or in the Midwest in general, you'll see a lot of scholars of the Hanafi tradition being called mufti, right? And this is a level of ijtihad within a school of fiqh, right? So this person uses the legal methodologies of one of the four mainstream schools in order to determine what the right answer is based on previous scholarly knowledge, previous scholarly work, and their own ability to conduct research as they've been trained and authorized to do. And usually, what'll happen is if you go to them with a situation that's clear cut, like, do I have to pray? And the answer is, I'm a sane adult male who has no injuries or any other ailments that would stop me from praying, then the answer would just be clearly yes, there's nothing there. But if you asked a question like, well, there's some alcohol in this medicine that I take, is it okay to take it? They would be able to go over the situation with you, whether there's alternatives or not, and give you an answer that applies directly to you based on your situation and circumstances. Now we come down a level and we get to your regular scholars. If it's fiqh, the faqih, right? Not the mufti, the person who's learned in fiqh or other fields of the Islamic sciences. This person, they're going off their training within a school of fiqh, right? They're not going to go outside the school. A mufti could technically say, in your situation, we're not going to take the opinion of the Hanafi school, for instance. We're going to go with a Hanbali opinion, or we're going to go with a Shafi opinion, or we're just going to go ahead and say, in your situation, it's very unique. You don't have to follow any of these rulings. We're going to give you a new ruling that applies just to you. When you come down that to the next level, to what you would generally consider general scholars, who are not at the level of ijtihad and they're not at the level of, giving rulings of their own, like new rulings. These people would be able to tell you, for instance, that this is what the ruling is on this matter. Like, for instance, is interest halal or haram? They would say interest is haram. You cannot engage in interest-based transactions, right? If you went to a mufti, they might go and tell you, as Mufti Taqi Usmani did, tell you that in certain situations, there may be a case where it is okay. Well, it's not okay, but you could engage in the transaction if you met certain situations. And that's where you see fatwas being issued on that matter, right? And they're talking about a certain place, a certain time, and a certain situation. They're not talking about everyone worldwide. So when you get to this level, we're talking about the faqih, the scholar in general of fiqh, they're going to give you the rulings as they learn. So they might be able to tell you every ruling in the book Al-Hidayah, if they're Hanafi, or they might be able to tell you every ruling in any book of fiqh, depending on their school. And they'd be a good place to go for general advice. How do I engage in this transaction? How do I pray? How do I do these things? They can tell you that. And some of them will give you specialized advice too by their own deductive reasoning, because while they may not hold themselves out as someone who practices ifta, they're not a mufti who gives fatwa, they might still give you advice and help you work through your problems. Now we'll come down to someone they know enough about the religion, but they're not really a scholar. And that's where most people are, right? Most of us are at a level where we're not ignorant of the religion. We know things. And what we do is we follow something, right? And this is where we're going to come into our discussion about, do you have to follow a madhab? And the answer is, everyone follows a madhab, right? And you'll hear this sometimes in the argument against following madhabs. You'll hear that you shouldn't follow one because we should follow the school of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? The Prophet's madhab. Well, unfortunately, we don't have him with us anymore, and there's new situations that arise. What the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught the Sahaba was how to take the revelation they had and deduce rulings, and then they would go back to him, and then he would either tell them, "You are right, that's the correct answer," or he would tell them, "No, that's not right. This is the answer." Right? And through that process, they learned how to do this. Now, the reason why typically scholars have learned from scholars, and if you're a mufti, you went and did ifta training with a scholar who's qualified to do it, is because it's inherited knowledge, right? It's knowledge passed down through time from the Prophet all the way through. So you might wonder, why are there different rulings from different schools? Well, the reason is because each school of fiqh has a different methodology. They're not bodies of law. That's something that a lot of people confuse. They would go, oh, the Hanafi body of law, the Shafi body of law. It's not actually a body of rulings. It's just the rulings deduced by a certain methodology. And scholars and muftis, they learn how to use that methodology. Now, in order to get to those higher levels, you have to have a base, right? You have to have a base in one of those schools' methodologies in order to have your own methodology, or in order to determine a better methodology that works for you if you're a scholar. For the average person, if you tried to deduce these rulings on your own, you might fall into some kind of misguidance, because as we know, the levels of ilm are broken down into 6 levels by scholar. Well, Ibn al-Qayyim had it written down, and many other scholars have used it as well. The first level, the highest level, is knowledge. When you comprehend something with true certainty as it really is. So this is the right answer, and you have certainty that it's the right answer because this is the truth. The next one is slight ignorance, which is you might know the answer, but you don't have full comprehension of it. And then we have aggravated or compound ignorance, which is when you comprehend something in a way contrary to the way it is. So you're comprehending it, but you're wrong. Like you're opposite or different from the way reality is. Then we have delusion. Delusion is where you think you comprehend something despite evidence which would cause you to realize you're not right. Then we have doubt, which is to think you comprehend something, yet you're aware of something contrary, which you think has the possibility of truth. And then preponderant belief, which is the comprehension of something despite the presence of something which is contrary to it, but less likely to be the truth, right? So the thing we're most worried about is compound ignorance. You may have talked to someone who's told you, I'm just going to follow the Quran and Sunnah. That's what I do, right? And then they say they're going to look at Hadith, they're going to look at Quran, they're going to figure it out. A lot of them fall into compound ignorance very quickly because what they don't understand is why differences exist between in practice, right? Why do some people raise their hands in prayer only with the initial takbir and other people raise it at different points? And someone who is following this might say, well, look, I see tons of hadith that say raise it at different points. Therefore, the person who only raises it at the beginning is wrong. Well, there's also hadiths where Sahaba tell you that the Prophet only raised his hands at the initial takbir and not at the later ones. So then the next question you have to ask yourself is, why would the Sahaba have two different opinions on the same thing? And the answer is really quite simple. Not the well, the Sahaba had two different answers, right? And why then do the different schools follow different versions of this? And this is where the answer actually gets simple. So the Hanafi school will tell you that the reason they only raise their hands at the initial takbir is because the hadith talking about raising your hands at other points are talking about an earlier point in time. And the ones saying that the Prophet ﷺ only raised them at the beginning are talking about his later practice. Now, of course, you have other scholars that disagree with that timeline and they follow the other one. The real answer is, since we have hadith that detail both, they both are correct. Neither person's prayer is wrong or invalid because of this. Again, if you weren't someone who had gone through a lot of training in Islamic studies, you might believe that one is the right answer and one is the wrong answer, and you might fall into a form of ignorance because you're not understanding the reasons why these rulings exist. So, because of that, for the average person, the average Muslim, if you were to follow a madhab, right? You said, I'm going to follow the Hanafi madhab. I'm going to get books of Hanafi fiqh. I'll look up my answers in there and then ask for clarification if I need it. That would not be wrong. That would be okay to do for the average Muslim. And if you happen to do something that ends up not being the right answer, you wouldn't be punished for that because you're trying to follow guidance, right? If you happen to follow a scholar who happens to also follow a school of fiqh, let's say they're Shafi this time, and they give you the rulings according to the Shafi school, you're fine because you're following a qualified scholar. right? You're not required as the average Muslim with no training in this religion or without enough training in the religion and the different Islamic sciences to come up with rulings on your own. In fact, you should not do that. I mean, there's even quotes from some of the great scholars like Ahmed ibn Hanbal. He even said that in order to do independent ijtihad, you would need to have hundreds of thousands of hadiths memorized. That's not just the wording of a hadith, but that's also their chains of narration and who the people are in those chains of narration, what their grade is as a narrator. Obviously, we're not going to do that. The most people are not going to do that. And that's why it's okay to follow a madhab. In fact, you could even say that you have to follow one. Because if you're not following a madhab, then that means you're also not following a qualified scholar. Because again, so let's say you decide to follow a madhab and you learn the madhab yourself and you follow it, at least in the things that are personally obligatory on you. Or you go to a scholar that follows a madhab and they teach you the things that are personally obligatory on you and you follow those things, right? The third possibility would be you go to a scholar who doesn't practice any of the recognized madhabs and they practice independent ijtihad or comparative fiqh. And you would not be wrong for following them either, as long as that is what you're doing. You're following the rulings that they're giving you and teaching you. You're not just deciding that, one day you're a Hanafi, the next day you're a Shafi, the next day, you follow a Salafi scholar just because it's what's convenient for you at the time. You stick with things, right? It's kind of like we have hadith that indicate when Asr time is. Is it the earlier time, one spear, the shadow of one spear length, or double the shadow, right? Well, both of them are valid and they're in hadith. In fact, most schools of fiqh, like the Hanafi school, Abu Hanafi's opinion was twice the length of an object. His companions, his main students, said it was one length of the object, which is what the other schools indicate. If you were to pick that you were going to pray at the later Asr time, that would be fine. It's okay to do that because that later time is still within Asr time according to every single school. If you were to pick the earlier time, that's fine. The majority of schools, your Asr prayer is in the right time, right? But you don't flip flop on it. It's not, oh no, I'm running late for Zuhr today, so I'm just going to pray like I'm a Hanafi today. And then the next day, you're like, I'm going to pray Asr early. Don't do that. Can't do that on a regular basis anyway. And this is why when you follow recognized scholarship, right? So for the average Muslim, you can follow a madhab, you can follow a scholar who follows a madhab, or you can follow a scholar who's doing something else, comparative fiqh or independent ijtihad if they're at that level, though that is very rare to find. And then you will not be guided on the wrong way. If, however, you find that you have an aptitude for religious studies and you want to learn how to make rulings yourself or how to research into a topic, get training in that. You don't have to become a full-fledged scholar to say, I am an expert in the fiqh of Salah, for instance, right? Anyone can go and study a book of fiqh with a scholar and learn that to a level that they have mastery of it, right? But again, if you want to get to that scholarly level, we're talking about a mastery of many sciences, many of the Islamic sciences, or at least one of the sciences in full. And that's why, again, for the average Muslim, it's easier just to follow a madhab or a scholar because this person has already done the work, or this school of thought has already done the work to give you the information you need right now. Because if you were born today and you were like, I have to figure out Islam, right? How long would that take you to complete what's essentially evolved over 1400 years? It would take you 1400 years probably to figure that out on your own. And before you could even do that, you'd have to have mastered many other things. So the short answer is yes, everyone should follow a madhab unless you happen to be a scholar who's learned the skills required to do research and come up with rulings on your own, or you follow a scholar who's doing that, because then you're not following misguidance. You're following someone who knows enough to know what they don't know and they need to look, because the worst possible thing you can do is think you know the answer when in reality you don't, right? Because that's that compound ignorance. And I can give a short example of this. Sometimes if you were educated in a more Salafi leaning tradition, you might have some ideas about the different schools of law and how they came about opinions. Like, for instance, oh, the reason why the Hanafis say one thing is because they weren't aware of a hadith. There was a hadith that they just weren't aware that it was there. When in reality, that's absurd, first of all, because you're talking about scholars throughout time, many of them who were masters of the science of hadith in their own right, and they just seem to have ignored this as what would be implied, right? When in reality, it's because the methodology they were using is the reason that that hadith didn't take precedence over another hadith. And that's why it's important to follow someone who is a scholar, or if you aren't and you happen to just be, I'm going to learn a school of fiqh, I'm going to learn how to do this, ask people who know, right? That phrase in the Quran is not telling you to ask people who do zikr, it's telling you to ask the people who know when you have questions, of course. And of course, if you don't have questions, check your understanding, because sometimes we read something, we watch videos, we listen to lectures, we think we understand what's been said, but in reality, we're not quite there. So it's important to talk with someone who does know to check your understanding. So the other question I know I posed was, what's the best madhab? And we'll close with that one. The best one is the one that is easiest for you to learn. So if you live in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and you're wondering what madhab you should practice, it's probably going to be the Hanafi madhab, because there will be more Hanafi scholars available to you, more Hanafi texts available to you. If you live in Indonesia, Malaysia, um, Brunei, it's probably the Shafi madhab, just to be honest. And if you live in Saudi Arabia, it'll be the Hanbali madhab. Now, of course, if you live in somewhere like the US, you'll be more aware of other madhabs as well. And honestly, the best thing to do is practice the one you know. If you happen to be convinced that a different one is better for you, that's fine. Just don't constantly flip flop between schools. And, like, you can't be a Hanafi today and then after 40 years of being a Hanafi decide you're a Maliki, for instance, unless you happen to have a Maliki scholar who is teaching you. And the reason you're doing that is because there's an absence of other kinds of scholars, or you have a genuine interest in learning. I myself have learned the Hanbali madhab. I'm partially through with the Hanafi madhab. I'm about 4 years into a 6-year program on that. And then the Shafi madhab will be next on my list. Why? I just really like to learn. Some people like that. They want to learn about all the different madhabs. They want to learn the methodologies and the rulings so that they can compare them and work within this religion. Most people won't want to do that. So again, find qualified scholarship, check your understanding of what you know, and of course, also check your understanding of what you think you know as well. So we'll end with that, with the idea that there is no best madhab. It's what's available to you where you are and what is easiest for you to practice and easiest for you to learn. So if you find one madhab is too hard and you find the other one a little easier, that's fine. If you find there's no information in your area on one, but there's a lot of information on the other, that's fine. The real answer here is follow some form of guidance, whether it be qualified scholar or a madhab. That's what's best for most Muslims. And if you happen to be inclined toward learning more and getting to a level where you can make those decisions yourself, that's also fine, as long as you seek that education and practice upon it. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop the recording and open for any questions that anyone has.